There's been a sharp rise in diplomatic tension between China and the UK following a warning from Beijing that it won't tolerate any interference in the affairs of Hong Kong. Boris Johnson has offered a path to British citizenship for up to 3 million Hong Kong residents following the imposition by China of new security laws. The Chinese say that the British offer amounts to gross interference, and they warn the UK not to treat China as an enemy. The UK argues that China has gone back on the agreement signed in 1997, which offered certain freedoms to Hong Kong people for 50 years. Our diplomatic correspondent James Robbins has the latest.
When Beijing is determined to silence all opposition in Hong Kong, this is a powerful new message. We'll write nothing that could be called subversion. The world already knows the freedoms we want restored. But from the moment China imposed its security laws and started fresh waves of arrests, Beijing has become more and more angry at Britain's response. The offer to millions of Hong Kongers of potential escape, instead of arrest, the chance to live, work and eventually settle in Britain as citizens. Now at China's embassy in London, the ambassador has moved to barely veiled threats. Britain, he says, is guilty of gross interference and will be the loser if it persists.
So we want to be your friend. We want to be your partner. But if you want to make China a hostile country, you have to bear the consequences.
And the ambassador also warned Britain about its future 5G network, which promises super-fast connectivity. Cut the Chinese giant Huawei out, he said, and Britain's entire trading future could be a victim. But Boris Johnson does seem to be moving away from Huawei on security grounds, talking today about not wanting the UK vulnerable to a high-risk state vendor. So I asked the Foreign Secretary where this is all heading.
The real issue here is one of trust, and whether China can be trusted to live up to its international obligations and its international responsibilities. And that's a message that we're telegraphing, along with many of our allies and indeed many international partners around the world, to Beijing, particularly in relation to what we've seen in Hong Kong.
And in Hong Kong, that will be a very welcome signal to leading pro-democracy activists. 3 of them have now appeared in court on charges related to last year's protests.
We still hope to encourage more people continue to engage in the democracy movement. Even they ban my book in public library, they can't ignore and silence the voice of Hong Kong people. With the belief of Hong Kong people to fight for freedom, we will never give up and surrender to Beijing.
With some education officials in Hong Kong apparently ordering a purge of reading material which does not teach students positively, all the signals are of a crisis in relations between London and Beijing, which is steadily worsening.
And James is with me now. We heard you there, James, asking the Foreign Secretary where all of this is heading. What is your reading of where it's going?
Well, this is clearly a really important test of will between Britain, a post-imperial power, and the power which surely will dominate, if it doesn't already, the second part of this century, that is China. And I think we should look for clues as to how both sides use that offer to thousands, potentially millions of Hong Kongers to come here. If they start to exercise that power, that right, how will China respond? I think the other really interesting thing about today is this all comes at a time when Dominic Raab was quite separately making an announcement to the House of Commons of new British, therefore non-EU, targeted sanctions against 47 named individuals who Britain holds accountable guilty of gross human rights abuses. Now, 25 of them are from Russia, more surprisingly perhaps 20 from Saudi Arabia. The Russians accused of complicity in the murder of Sergei Magnitsky, the lawyer. The Saudis accused of active complicity in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Now, I particularly asked the Foreign Secretary if going after Saudi Arabia risked the potential for jobs disappearing in Britain. We sell so many arms to Saudi Arabia, might there be a commercial retaliation? He said, actually, the most important thing is that we stand up against the thugs of despots, the henchmen and the killers. He took a very high moral position. And if he pursues that in relation to China, that will be really interesting. He was asked by me, but earlier by MPs, whether he might move to name and therefore impose sanctions on Chinese individuals over their treatment of the Uyghurs. He didn't rule that out and said that new lists of names were being drawn up for targeted sanctions.
James, again, many thanks. James Robbins there for us, our diplomatic correspondent.